back to the final segment of the course where we're going to talk about race and health equity and health disparities and the construct of social justice. And as somebody pointed out in the discussion, I'm sorry I can't recall who right now, it's very difficult to understand racism if we don't understand race and what race means. And several of you, I noticed, referred to race as a social construction, which makes me very happy. So we're going to start talking about race there, and what are the races, and what do they mean, and where do they come from? And so I had you all do this exercise with the circles. And the point of that was just to show, one, how we tend to think about things and how we categorize without necessarily thinking through why we categorize in those ways, but also to get you to recognize that as difficult as it is to separate these 6 circles into different categories, imagine how much more complex it becomes when we think about trying to categorize human beings. And we all bring our preconceived notions and our preconceived ideas to this exercise. And so not everybody is going to answer them in the same way. But the most common way that I've seen this answered is people putting together 1, 3, and 4, and then 2, 5, and 6 go together. Now, whether or not 2, 5, and 6 really all belong in the same group is a conversation for another time. But one of the most common reasons people pick 1, 3, and 4 is because there's a solid black portion. It doesn't matter if the other portion is striped, if it's divided in half, it's divided in quarters, if it's solid white, that's what people tend to see. So that's the most common. Some people put 1, 2, and 6, right? They all have solid white portions. Another way that's slightly less common is white. The number 1 is all by itself, and 2 through 4, 5, 6, because they all have striped. And are they divided by quarters or halves, etc. So there are many different ways, but it can get very complex very quickly. And these are just 6 circles. This is not 3 billion people on the planet. And so when we talk about race, we have to think about what it is that we're bringing to the table. What are our notions about it? And so I want to start off about talking about race as both a social construction and an essentialization. So what do I mean by social construction and essentialization? Well, social construction means that the concept of race cannot be divorced of its social setting or it loses all meanings. Thus, the specifics of race or racial categories only make sense within a particular social system. And when we move outside of that particular cultural or social system, the particulars of those racial categories change. And so when we look at how we define race in the United States, that's going to be very different than if we're in another country. And the concept, while durable, can change over time. So how we identify racially as a country and who gets categorized where is not static by any means. And essentialization is the idea that the process of racialization, of identifying a group as, quote, other, is based on the belief, not the fact, but the belief that that group has certain physical, biological, and thus essential traits that distinguish it. The central idea behind essentialization is that you can somehow, quote, see race and racial difference. As we know, however, racial categories, even if they do maintain some semblance of cultural meaning, frequently break down at the edges at the very least. For example, in the early 1960s, a white American reporter interviewed Papa Doc Duvalier, who was the dictatorial leader of Haiti at the time. She asked him what percentage of Haitians were white. Duvalier responded 98%. Thinking that he must have misunderstood the question, she repeated it, and he responded with the same answer. Looking puzzled, he asked her, quote, "How do you define black in your country?" And she answered that anyone with a drop of black blood in them was considered black, and he responded, "This is how we define white in my country." So how we define black and white, again, are not neat and tidy. And this is really the easiest way to see that race is a social construct. Another way is to consider the idea of passing. If a person can pass, quote, pass as white, are they white or are they black? And do these categories even have any meaning then? And so I put up, for discussion, a PowerPoint where I asked you to categorize people, 20 different faces, into these 5 racial categories. And I think you'll find that if you haven't done it already, um, it's a lot more challenging than you think initially it's going to be. We all tend to think we know what race is, and we know it when we see it and we can identify people, but it gets a little bit more challenging. And a more recent situation that was in the news about a year ago um, was a woman named Rachel Dolezal, whose parents were, from a social perspective, biological parents were white, but she chose to style her hair in a particular way, and she self-identified as African American, and that became a big issue of was she um, was it sort of taking on, was that a right? How do you define, what is it, if race is a social construction, can people define themselves however they like? And it's an interesting debate to have about cultural appropriation versus cultural appreciation. So let's talk about the racialization, and more specifically about racialized American society. A racialized society is one in which social actors or people are placed within a hierarchy according to race. Race, as we know, is commonly expressed as having a particular phenotype, and a phenotype is the expression of a specific trait based on biological influences. However, the selection of which phenotypic traits to use to designate a racial group is a social construction. So, our genes determine how we look, but it's the selection of biological markers that are culturally defined. And so, it's the race and racialization and the social construction of race is the idea that race uses perceived biological markers to justify and explain the construction. And racialized social systems actually occur in tandem with the creation of other social hierarchies or structures. For example, the race that's posited in the superior position also receives economic benefits, education benefits, and cultural benefits. And often there are less tangible cultural benefits as well, where the superior quote unquote race is considered more attractive, more intelligent, better capable, etc. And together, these form a racialized social system. And although the relative position of actors within this system is static, the particulars of the system can change over time. Thus, in the United States, the means of domination over African Americans during slavery was achieved one way, and another way entirely during the period of Reconstruction and Jim Crow after the Civil War. In the more recent period, after the Civil Rights Movement, the mechanism has been less overtly racist and has become more closely tied to things like property ownership and education. But this idea of the science of race didn't come out of nowhere. In fact, it has a very specific history. And so, if we recognize that races are social and not biological constructions, where did these racial categories come from? Well, the categories that we still tend to use today are not at all scientific or natural, but were created about 200 or over 200 years ago. In 1795, a German doctor named Johann Friedrich Blumenbach wrote a very influential book titled On the Natural Varieties of Mankind. And in it, and in subsequent works, Blumenbach separated humans into 5 races based on their physical features that he selected. According to Blumenbach, physical characteristics of groups of people could be used to designate not only who they were, but also their intelligence. And he separated populations into Caucasian or white, Mongolian or yellow, Malayan or brown, Negro or black, and American or red, referring to Native Americans. And he then went on to use those categories to assign rankings of intelligence and aptitude. Thus, the fair skin and high brows of Caucasians, according to Blumenbach, indicated higher intelligence. The folds around the eyes of Mongolians and their yellow skin indicated their craftiness, which could express itself as deceitfulness. And the dark skin and smaller brows of the Negro race indicated their close biological connection to primates, according to Blumenbach. And his studies gave the stamp of scientific truth not only to the idea of races, but of the connection between race and intelligence. And the use of terms like Caucasoid and Mongoloid and Negroid gave the whole system an air of scientific rationality, when it was in fact based on nothing scientific at all. Although we've made some progress as a society, these racial categories and ideas are still the ones that society by and large clings to, although that picture is now complicated by the notion of ethnicity. By the 1970s, scholars began to move beyond race, and anthropologists and sociologists increasingly began to study something they called ethnicity. These studies were connected to the ideas of race, but had some important distinctions. Whereas racial identity was seen as exclusive, that is, it was about the creation of categories of other in opposition to whiteness that was accepted as both superior and normative. Ethnicity, on the other hand, was seen as inclusive. Ethnicity was a way of making sense of cultural differences. And people tend to place themselves within ethnic groups, but have their racial identity placed upon them. Ethnicity was seen as real, linked to nationality, culture, language, culture, etc., and race was coming to be seen as unreal, as a social construction. The problem was that the new interest in studying ethnicity over race led many to conclude that what was typically seen as race was in fact ethnicity. Thus, they argued, African Americans did not constitute a separate race, but rather a separate ethnicity. And as a result, some neoconservatives argued that African Americans were just another ethnicity working their way up the social ladder, as European immigrants had done. One glaring problem with this argument is that it overlooks the fact that various European groups became fully white and socially accepted within a few decades of their arrival in large numbers in America. African Americans have been here since the early 17th century. Why has the progress, or how has the process worked so much more slowly for blacks? The other problem with white ethnicity is that it's not as persistent as some would have us believe. We may claim to be Italian American or Polish American, but interethnic mixing is so pervasive that many Americans don't have any real consciousness of their European roots. In fact, European immigrant ethnic identity was lost as the price paid for becoming quote-unquote white. And this Anglo-conformity has allowed non-Anglo-Saxon Europeans to share a privileged racial category while not necessarily sharing a privileged class ranking. Because of this Anglo-conformity and the whiteness it affords, linguistic and cultural survival among ethnic groups of color is often viewed with scorn. If they retain too much ethnicity, these groups run the risk of being labeled unassimilable. They cannot assimilate. And this has been the problem that Latinos have faced in the United States. So let's go back to race and racism. Racism provides the framework for the interaction between individual and social actors. It's the mechanism that prescribes how social, political, and economic interactions are to take place. Racism cannot exist without a racialized social system. However, once the system is in place, racism can attain a high level of autonomy. And racism serves to perpetuate the system while at the same time masking the true causes of it. Because of this, it permeates nearly every aspect of social interactions. This means that there are many forms of racism that those in the dominant position don't even reflect on. For example, joining the White Aryan Nation or the KKK is obviously a racist thing to do. Refusing to rent an apartment to an African American simply because they are black is also obviously racist. At the same time, less overtly racist actions abound. What if you choose to live in an all-white gated neighborhood? Is that racist? What if you prefer to send your children to an affluent primarily white suburban school or a private school? I'll come back to those in a few minutes. And when you think about those questions, right, so the system of race and racism really obscures the true form and function. So whiteness is not questioned, but otherness is, because whiteness is seen as normative. So I want to give you just a little bit of history here, and we'll go back again to some I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought. To think about racialization and racism in America in the history. Right? So in 1607, we have the Jamestown colony, which brought about some economic exploitation. By 1690, 20 Africans were brought to the colony by Dutch traders. During the 1640s and 1670s, there were harsher punishments for black servants than for white servants. And again, initially they were not brought over as slaves, they were brought over as servants. You then saw Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, where 500 disenfranchised whites and a handful of African Americans rebelled against the punishments that they were experiencing as servants. And the legacy of the rebellion is that white servants have an expectation of equality, but black servants and slaves do not. And thus, skin color was used to drive a wedge between economic classes. And so the creation of race in order to split class interest allowed for them to racialize the economic system and create biological justification for the racialized slave system. And so you see this, it happened in the 1600s. If you look into the civil rights era in the late 1960s or early to late 1960s and early 1970s, what you see is that in a number of cases, the arguments that were being made were not about race for civil rights. They were about economic rights, about the divide between the wealthy and the poor. And in order to keep those rebellions down, to keep the poor from rising up against the wealthy, these racial wedges were put in. So if you could separate the white poor from the black poor and make the white poor feel like they were losing out because of the black poor, or that they were somehow better than or should expect more than, you could quash the rebellion that was initially based on economic reasons. And there's been a tendency over the past several decades to believe, and particularly during the previous presidential administration, to believe that our nation had become more multicultural and diverse, and that the problem of race and racism would be on the wane. Right? To think that we live in a post-race society. But while it has become increasingly clear over the past several decades and the past several months that race is merely a social construction, it has also become painfully clear that race is most definitely a social reality. Despite the advances that we have made, the idea of race still exists. And furthermore, racism abounds in our society. The arguments that racism were on the decline tend to center on demographics, moreover, extrapolation of demographic trends. Some people have argued that racism, that as the United States is becoming more racially and ethnically diverse, it's only a matter of time before the majority become the minority, before mixing takes place and everyone will have a little bit of everything in them. History, however, proves them wrong. In fact, the argument that quote-unquote crossbreeding will defeat racism dates back to the era of the Civil War. And it must be remembered that in the 19th century, southern states had large black populations, sometimes the majority, and extensive race mixing, and yet were still slave-holding states. California is another good example. It's the most diverse state in the nation. At the same time, however, California has passed a slew of anti-black, anti-Latino, and anti-immigration measures. And this is because race is less about skin color and more about a system of power and privilege. Those who believe that race is over often ignore the fact that race and racism still structure our social system and even our individual interactions. Whiteness confers material advantages in our society, and so long as that remains the case, race and racism will continue to exist. And there is no good evidence that this system of privilege is on the wane. The legal scholar John Powell has shown that among the 8 million Americans living in areas of concentrated poverty, where 40% or more of the residents live below the poverty line, in 1990, half were African American and a quarter were Latino. In the decade between 1985 and 1995, the incarceration rate for black men rose 143%, and for black women by 204%. African American males born in 1990 are given a 29% of chance of being imprisoned in their life. Latino men are given a 60% chance. White men, 4%. And for those of you who remember Hurricane Katrina, it revealed to the nation that 80+% of New Orleans' poor residents were African American. And so race and racism can be seen as a problem of unrecognized privilege. So, since the civil rights movement, minority disadvantages are usually posited as stemming from personal failings rather than structural inequalities. And this is especially the case since the civil rights movement. With the end of legal segregation and with the passage of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act in 1964 and 1965, respectively, the discourse of race and racism has changed. White society tends to see the problems of racism as stemming from legal discrimination, and with the end of that, thus the end of institutionalized racism. And where racism does exist, it's seen as the result of a few misunderstood or misinformed individuals. Now, the failings of communities of color are seen as the result of personal failings. The idea that there is a, quote, culture of poverty that exists in African American and Latino cultures. And this culture of poverty, it's argued, promotes sexual licentiousness, childbirth out of wedlock, crime, welfare dependency, and a high level of group entitlement. And there's little drive to interrogate the ways in which these cultural problems, or quote unquote cultural problems, are actually linked to structural inequalities that is resurfaced in the post-civil rights movement era. Some scholars, in fact, have argued that the civil rights legislation actually strengthens the system of privilege. And that's not because civil rights laws are bad. Rather, it's because the ways in which they've traditionally been written makes them weak and unenforceable. As George Lipsitz has written, massive white opposition to the implementation, rather than the mere articulation, of anti-discrimination statutes stands as a stunning indictment of the character of European Americans and shows how the racial problems in the United States remain, at heart, a white problem. So let's take two examples: housing and fair housing and education. So, fair housing. Between 1924 and 1950, realtors across the U.S. held to a national code that stated, quote, a realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property or occupancy, members of any race or nationality, or any individual whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in the neighborhood. When and where this code was not enough to preserve the whiteness of certain neighborhoods, covenants and/or mob violence were often used. This is especially the case in the northern suburban communities in the 1940s and 1950s. Covenants were private agreements written into deeds that restricted the resale to racial minorities. As private agreements, their legal validity and constitutionality were routinely upheld by the courts. In 1948, the Supreme Court did rule in Shelley versus Kramer that it was unconstitutional for state courts to uphold the covenants when it went against the will of the buyer and seller. Yet, the court left it open to property owners to adhere to the covenants voluntarily. Even after the decision, the Federal Housing Authority recommended and in some cases even required restrictive covenants as conditions for receiving government-secured home mortgages. Furthermore, Shelley did not touch at all the practice of redlining or blockbusting, which continued. Redlining is the practice of denying home mortgages to those who live in minority communities. And blockbusting is the practice of using white fear of having large numbers of racial minorities moved into the communities, get those whites to sell their homes at low prices. And realtors would then turn around and sell those homes to minorities at large markups. In 1962, President Kennedy issued an executive order which required government agencies to oppose discrimination in federally supported housing. However, it was met with such large-scale passive resistance, and the FHA routinely refused to apply the executive order to its loans. Then, in 1964, the Civil Rights Act specifically exempted federal mortgage insurance programs, where most people got their mortgages from at the time, from anti-discrimination requirements, meaning that government-issued FHA loans could be issued discriminatorily. In 1966, President Lyndon Johnson asked Congress to pass a fair housing bill. As a result, according to one White House aide, Lyndon Johnson received, quote, some of the most vicious mail LBJ received on any subject. And remember, LBJ was president during the Vietnam War and routinely received strongly worded mail from anti-war protesters. Angry with Johnson's request, the House passed a bill that did the exact opposite of what he wanted. It acknowledged the right of individual property owners to discriminate when selling their homes and required realtors to discriminate as well. And it was only after a filibuster by its opponents that the bill was defeated in the Senate. In 1968, Congress finally passed the Fair Housing Act. The law, however, contained virtually no teeth. So it authorized the Office of Housing and Urban Development to investigate complaints, but only if those claims were made directly to the HUD secretary. This would be like you having a problem and asking to speak directly to the Secretary of Defense. So, a little bit challenging. Even then, the law gave the Secretary only 30 days to process the complaint and decide if action was warranted, but gave the agency no power to punish. Instead, HUD could only ask the violator if he or she wished to have a conference on the matter. And in some cases, legal action could be taken, but only if the discrimination was the result of a pattern of practice, and held punitive damages to a maximum of only $1,000. Of course, resistance and refusal to comply with the law continued. For example, in 1969, the Chicago Housing Authority was ordered by a judge to build 700 new public housing units in white neighborhoods and locate 75% of new public housing outside of the inner city ghetto. The Chicago Housing Authority resisted and decided to halt construction of all new public housing in order to evade the judge's order. In 1970, Congress passed the Uniform Relocation Assistance and Real Property Acquisition Act. And this act required housing authorities to replace low-income units they destroyed. So if they destroyed something to build something new, they had to replace it somewhere else. It was only a very brief victory for the champions of housing equality. The opposition in Congress quickly managed to eliminate the government's urban renewal program altogether. And they replaced the program with community development block grants. And these grants emphasized upscale housing, for middle and upper class home buyers. In St. Louis, for example, they evicted 500 families, most of them African American, from a redevelopment zone, gave almost $6 million in tax breaks to developers, demolished 9 buildings at the city's expense, secured an additional $1.4 million in federal development block grants, and sold parcels of land to developers for only $122 per parcel. Because the redevelopment company was private, and because the funding came from block grants and not urban renewal funds, the dislocated families received absolutely no money for relocation assistance. In subsequent years, additional laws were passed that sought to remedy housing discrimination. But throughout the Reagan years, these laws were routinely ignored, and very few suits were brought against violators. And because of strong white resistance to housing desegregation, cost for racial minorities has gone up considerably. It's been estimated that discrimination in housing alone costs the average black family $4,000 more per year than their white counterparts as a result of higher mortgage rates. And that's when you control for occupation, income, etc. For those who are effectively barred from participating in the housing market, because $4,000 is a lot of money, they can neither build equity nor qualify for a homeowner's tax deduction. And this does not include the social costs. The quality of education in this country is often directly tied to property tax base of the supporting community. In addition, as more companies build in the suburbs, and as public transportation faces increased cuts and costs, those who are kept out of the suburbs are often kept far from where the jobs are. But let's switch now from housing to education. In 1954, the Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, the decision was hailed as the end of school segregation. The Brown decision, however, only addressed legal segregation in the abstract. It did not prohibit other means of segregation. It did not discuss the connections between education segregation and housing or employment. And as a result, it did nothing to prevent whites from moving to suburbs and creating their own school districts. Additionally, the court only required that schools move with, quote, or desegregate with all deliberate speed. No time limit was given, thus allowing whites to stall and even thwart change. In most cases of constitutional rights, the Supreme Court requires immediate redress. In the case of Brown, however, the court realized that there would be white resistance and so allowed a delay. It was not until the late 1960s and early 1970s that the court began to look at actual remedies for segregation. It was not until 1971, for example, that the court stepped in and ruled that busing was an adequate remedy. And it was not until the 1975 and 1977 Bradley versus Milliken cases that the court declared that, quote, all deliberate speed timeline had run out. This 20-year delay encouraged whites to view remedies such as busing as worse violations of their children's rights than the system of segregation was for the black children. And perhaps the most egregious desegregation case decided by the court was in 1973, San Antonio Independent High School District versus Rodriguez decision. In its decision, the court acknowledged that the education provided to Mexican American children in San Antonio, Texas, was inferior to that provided to their white counterparts. The court held, however, that education was not a fundamental right that enjoyed constitutional protection. Therefore, the court decided that it could not compel an equal distribution of resources even within the same school district, and thus the city could continue to fund white schools better than Mexican American schools. In the Bradley versus Milliken busing cases, as I said, there were two, the court did acknowledge that various government agencies had created and then maintained a system of discrimination in Detroit's public schools. They also accepted that private sector real estate actions led to housing segregation that made school integration within the districts impossible. Still, the court ruled 5-4 against cross-district busing, led by Justice Potter Stewart's assertion that segregation in Detroit's school system was, quote, was caused by, quote, unknown and unknowable factors. The continued segregation of our nation's school ensures that many students of color receive inferior education with far fewer resources and often in buildings that are literally crumbling around them. As one writer aptly put it, quote, whites tell pollsters that they believe that blacks are offered equal opportunities, but fiercely resist any effort to make them send their own children to the schools they insist are good enough for blacks. And this system of de facto segregation has, if anything, gotten worse over the decades. As a nation, we collectively express our dismay and even outrage when we hear a case of racial violence or discrimination. Yet very few of us question the system of institutionalized racism, of privilege and power that ensures that race will continue to be a social reality precisely at a time when science has shown us that there is no biological or genetic basis for racial categorization. Yes, racism is about using racial epithets and about using the N-word, but it's also, and more important, about the legal, economic, political, social, and cultural institutions that have been created to perpetuate and maintain power and privilege at the expense of people of color. This does not mean that whites are evil. They're not. But it means that most people don't reflect on the system of privilege because it seems perfectly normal. And therein lies the problem. Thinking about all of these things, in the next lecture, we'll talk about what impact this segregation in housing, segregation in education, which does still exist, how does that tie into public health? What impact does racism have on health outcomes?